thesis at UBC, at UBC Okanagan in the Tectonics and Geochronology group. So obviously this project is full of ideas and efforts from many people. So I'd just like to acknowledge a few of them before starting. Dr. Kyle Larson, my supervisor, Shreya Roy, almost doctor, a PhD candidate in the group that I worked very closely with, Dr. Sudeep Shrestha and Dr. Mark Button from the Filter Lab at UBC Okanagan, and then those who helped us in the field, so Pasang Tamang, Pradap Tamang, Nima Tamang, and Sovit Tamang, who guided us through a very wet field season in Nepal, and then just generally everyone at the UBC Tectonics group. So, with that, my thesis asked the question, what controlled the structural evolution of the South Tibetan detachment system? But first, I will answer the question, what is the South Tibetan detachment system and why do we care about it? So, the South Tibetan detachment system, or the STDS as it is used in abbreviations throughout the slides, is one of the first order structures in the Himalayan origin. It runs parallel to the strike of the origin and it can be traced along its entire length, that is over 2,000 kilometers. In short, it is a normal sense detachment that separates the Himalayan mid crust from the Himalayan upper crust. And it's actually a network of low angle shear zones and faults that accommodated tens or even hundreds of kilometers of normal sense displacement between these two units, the Himalayan mid and upper crust. And it's also a synconvergent structure. That means that extensional activity along the South Tibetan detachment system occurred simultaneous to shortening on other major thrust faults in the origin during convergence accommodation. So, within the context of the Himalayan evolution, the South Tibetan detachment system plays a critical role in facilitating the exhumation of the Himalayan mid-crustal core, as illustrated in these diagrams. More generally, its activation and deactivation are linked to major and critical shifts in the dynamics of the origin. So, if we want to understand the driving forces of the evolution of the Himalayan origin, we have to understand the story of the South Tibetan detachment system. So, in this presentation, I'll start with an overview of Himalayan tectonics to put the South Tibetan detachment system into context. I'll discuss the knowledge gaps on the detachment system. Then I will present my master's research, which is a multidisciplinary South Tibetan detachment system case study in the Tsum Valley of the Central Himalaya. And finally, I'll compare my findings with findings of other very similar studies that have been coming out over the last few years and discuss their tectonic implications. So with that, we'll get into it. So as most of you are likely familiar, the Himalaya is the product of the continental collision between the Indian and Eurasian plates, which began about 55 million years ago and is still ongoing today. And during this collision, the Indian plate subducted beneath the Eurasian plate, and that caused significant crustal shortening and thickening in an overall compressional setting. So this here is a lithotectonic map of the Himalayan arc. And the different colors represent the different major rock sequences that make up the Himalaya. These rocks all have various provenance, metamorphic grades, and deformation histories. And of note is that all of these units are highly continuous over the entire strike of the Himalayan origin. So now if we take a north-south transect across this arc, we get a cross section that shows us the disposition of these different rock units within the Himalayan crust. And we can see that they are all bound by a series of north dipping major thrusts and shear zones. And most of these are thrust structures, so these three here, showing top-south movement, and that's consistent with the overall compressional setting of the origin. From oldest to youngest, these are called the main central thrust, the main boundary thrust, and the main frontal thrust. The fourth major structure, which is actually the structurally highest of the origin and the most hinterlandward, is the South Tibetan Detachment System. And unlike the rest of the major structures in the origin, the South Tibetan Detachment System shows a top north sense of displacement, which means that it is a normal sense structure. In its hanging wall, we have this blue unit here. This is called the Tethyan sedimentary sequence, and it represents the low-grade upper crustal rocks of the Himalaya. And in its footwall, it's this pink unit. This is called the Greater Himalayan sequence, and that represents the high-grade mid-crustal core of the Himalayan origin. And together, the South Tibetan Detachment System at the top and the main central thrust below form the boundary structures of this Greater Himalayan sequence. And they have been found to be coeval. That means that normal displacement on the South Tibetan Detachment System occurred simultaneously to thrusting on the main central thrust. So when the South Tibetan Detachment System was discovered, it was surprising because low angle normal faults were being identified elsewhere in extensional settings, but here we have one in a contractional setting, parallel to and occurring simultaneously to convergence, and also that we can trace along the entire length of the origin. So at the time, this was inconsistent with prevailing models of orogenic tectonics. So this brought on an era of numerical modeling, and very quickly, models emerged incorporating the South Tibetan Detachment System into the overall story of the evolution of the Himalaya. And a few of these models are pictured here. So the idea is that following the initial phase of Himalayan tectonics, so initial convergence and crustal thickening, prograde metamorphism after collision, a switch in kinematics occurred, which led to the exhumation of the high grade mid crustal core of the Himalaya, which is this greater Himalayan sequence here. And it underwent self directed exhumation. So these models explain that this exhumation was facilitated by simultaneous movement along the South Tibetan Detachment System at the top and the main central thrust below. And this exhumation initiated as the upper crust decoupled from the mid crust along the South Tibetan Detachment System. So this is why we say that the activation of the South Tibetan Detachment System led to critical change in the overall dynamics of the origin. Now, each of these models predicted different internal deformations expected within the Greater Himalayan sequence and at its boundaries, as well as timing of motion on the different structures and within the Greater Himalayan sequence. So, following all of these models, many studies set out to try to quantify flow parameters within the Greater Himalayan sequence and at the structures at its boundaries to try to compare with those predicted by the models, and also to try to develop more realistic models for the evolution of the Himalaya. This included several studies that looked at the South Tibetan Detachment System and tried to constrain its extent, the displacement along it, shear senses, the vorticity of flow, so pure and simple shear distribution, deformation temperatures, and also the relative timing of the detachment system with other processes in the mid-crust. But while these studies allowed for comparing with the prevailing models, they were limited in explaining movement along the South Tibetan Detachment System from a mechanistic perspective. That is, what mechanisms controlled this distribution and timing of flow. So we can think here of our classical shear zone model, where the rheologies in the shear zone respond to changes in temperature profiles with structural level and over time as well. And that leads to varying width of the active shear zone and where precisely the strain localizes. So in the South Tibetan Detachment System, we want to understand what led to flow activating at the boundary between the mid and upper crust, and also what controlled its subsequent evolution internally and its internal deformation. So this considers variations in structural level, temperature, lithology, partial melting, and all of these varied throughout different portions of the shear zone with time. So to investigate this, Studies like those I presented in the previous slide of kinematics need to be coupled with studies looking at the microscale deformation processes operating within the shear zone and their impacts on its strength. So this is actually a very complex consideration because the South Tibetan detachment system typically spans many kilometers and includes a whole range of different rock types and metamorphic grades. And the architecture of the South Tibetan detachment system is also variable along the strike of the Himalaya. So actually, typically, the South Tibetan detachment system is mapped as two structures, an earlier lower shear zone and a later shallow brittle fault at higher structural level. And while the earlier shear zone, we can trace it pretty much along the entire strike of the Himalaya, the later shallow brittle fault cannot be traced along its entire length. So we see these differences in expression of the South Tibetan detachment system zone that are indicating that there's some variable control, perhaps lithology, structure, temperature, along the strike of the Himalaya that is impacting the way that strain evolves and localizes at the South Tibetan detachment system. So that brings me to presenting my case study in the Tsum Valley. The goal was to investigate relative importance of lithological, structural, and temporal controls on the evolution of the South Tibetan detachment system in terms of where and how strain was distributed over time. To do this, I used a multidisciplinary approach, studying kinematics and deformation processes within the shear zone and attempting to link them together, and also to understand the time transgressive nature of the deformation. I directly dated deformation fabrics from within the zone using in situ rubidium strontium geochronology of micas. This is exciting because historically the South Tibetan detachment system had only been dated through indirect methods with cross-cutting relationships with leucogranite, for example. So altogether, the ultimate goal, as is the title of the slide, was to create a time-resolved kinematic and deformation history for the South Tibetan detachment system in the Tsum Valley in order to understand what controlled its evolution. So this is my field area. This is the Manaslu section. And the Tsum Valley is in the Manaslu section. Here it is, in this black box here. Um, This region features typical Himalayan tectonic stratigraphy. So we have the Greater Himalayan sequence in brown and yellow, which is composed of gneisses, schists, migmatites, and then in blue, the Tethyan sedimentary sequence, composed of Paleozoic to Mesozoic sediments. Now, historically, the South Tibetan detachment system in the region had been mapped as two structures, a lower structure that is a ductile structure and lies wholly within the Greater Himalayan sequence, and a later structure, which is a brittle to ductile brittle structure that lies at structurally higher levels. A key feature in this section is the Manaslu Pluton. So this is a big kilometer scale leucogranite pluton that pawns at the interface between the Greater Himalayan sequence and the Tethyan sedimentary sequence. And these plutons are actually really common along the strike of the Himalaya. So it's all these black dots that you can see in this diagram up here. These are many different plutons like the Manaslu Pluton. So it's a very common process in the Himalaya, and we're interested in understanding it. And the Manaslu section is actually one of the type localities for trying to understand this Plutonism and partial melting in the Greater Himalayan sequence that led to it. So we can see that here, from the Manaslu Pluton, there is this thin sheet that extends towards the east into my field area. That's called the Chokeng Arm. And while it has been identified, it hasn't really been mapped back to the Manaslu Pluton, and its chemical and temporal relationship with the main Manaslu Pluton had also not been studied. Furthermore, in the Tsum Valley, The South Tibetan Detachment System had yet to be mapped, so it was still unsure whether it was a single or composite structure in this area. So we can see here A to A prime, that's the transect that we did. And from it, we get this cross section. So in the field area in the Tsum Valley, rocks at different structural levels exhibited varying shear senses. And to give a preliminary definition to the South Tibetan Detachment System zone, we use the structurally highest and lowest occurrence of shear with a top north component, which reflects the expected normal sense motion on the South Tibetan Detachment System. We did not identify a brittle fault at upper structural level in the field. So instead, we mapped the South Tibetan Detachment System as a single ductile shear zone that affects both Greater Himalayan sequence and Tethyan sedimentary sequence rocks. In the Tsum Valley, the Greater Himalayan sequence to Tethyan sedimentary sequence boundary represents a very sharp lithology change. And this is important because it means that comprised within the shear zone, there is a very sharp change in lithology from the silicate-rich rocks to carbonate-rich rocks. And this has potentially important rheological implications. I'd also like to draw your attention here to the white unit. This is the Chokyang Arm leucogranite that we just discussed. And we can see that based on the top north definition of the shear zone, this leucogranite is actually included within the top north zone, so within the South Tibetan Detachment System zone. Now, we can combine shear senses observed in the field with microstructural observations of shear sense from things like asymmetric, class, and composite foliations. So here on the left is a representation of the shear senses that we see throughout the transect. The y-axis here is structural distance, where the 0 represents the top of that defined top north zone. So everything above 0 is above the top north zone. And this highlighted box here represents the structural levels for which we see this top north component in both field and microstructural observations. And I'd like to draw your attention here to the fact that immediately above and beneath this top north zone, we see rocks showing an top east shear sense. So this highlights that there's potentially some complexity in the shear zone boundaries. Now, there's been a lot of studies that have highlighted the importance of defining shear zone boundaries, not just using expected shear sense, but also using structural criteria like strain magnitude. And one proxy for strain magnitude is the crystallographic distribution strength of key strain accommodating minerals. This can be calculated from electron backscatter diffraction data, so looking at the orientation of crystal lattices. Two commonly used indices for this crystallographic distribution strength are the M and J index, and both of these increase with increasing strain magnitude. So I calculated these using electron backscatter diffraction data for quartz in the Greater Himalayan sequence and calcite in the Tethyan sedimentary sequence, as these are the major strain accommodating minerals in each unit. And what we see is that at both the lower and upper boundaries of that top north zone, we do see an increase in relative strain magnitude. So this more or less agrees with our definition of the shear zone boundaries. However, this match is not actually perfect, and we see that the rocks directly above and below the top north zone show relatively high strain magnitude. And this presence of very high strain rocks showing top east shear at both the boundaries of the top north zone is once again hinting that there is likely some complexity in the flow processes at the shear zone boundaries. Now, we can look at the flow geometry using kinematic vorticity studies. And kinematic vorticity allows us to estimate the percentage of pure and simple shear of flow. There's a lot of different methods we can use to do this. I used the ones that were applicable to my samples. So in the Tethyan sedimentary sequence, I looked at calcite C-axis distributions. And in the Greater Himalayan sequence, I looked at the orientation of C prime shear bands in composite foliations. And what we see is that there's an important component of both pure and simple shear pretty much everywhere along the transect, with some exceptions. And this is called general shear flow. We can also look at the distribution of crystallographic vorticity axes to get more information on the flow geometry. So this is what the data looks like here in red. And the results basically highlighted a monoclinic flow geometry throughout the section and also showed complexity at the shear zone boundaries. So combined with deformation processes, we can try to understand all these different kinematics that we're seeing. Well, that brings me to the next section where we're going to look at the deformation processes. We can use information from several different methods to try to answer the questions. What are the major strain accommodating minerals, and by which mechanisms are they deforming at these varying structural levels? So I used a mix of petrography to look for grain scale evidence for minerals being deformed and for their characteristic microstructures arising from specific deformation mechanisms in each of these minerals. In the Greater Himalayan sequence, I also made micro XRF maps to try to get a better idea or to better visualize how these different minerals are distributed throughout the rock and their degree of connectivity. And finally, electron backscatter diffraction is very useful for looking at the internal misorientation within individual grains affected by deformation. So I'll present the deformation processes from structurally lower to structurally higher levels. So starting at the lowest levels within the Greater Himalayan sequence, I saw that deformation had a distributed style across all major constituent minerals, including feldspar, quartz, and mica. And at this structural level, quartz is deforming primarily by grain boundary migration, so dynamic recrystallization, where grain boundary migration is the major mechanism. So moving towards higher structural levels within the Greater Himalayan sequence, we start to see a more localized deformation style. So here, the deformation is localized into quartz and mica layers, and these deform around a strain-free feldspar class. We can see this in this map here, showing the grain reference orientation distribution of quartz in red and feldspar in blue. So we see that quartz shows high internal misorientations, but feldspar does not. We also see with these higher structural levels that the deformation mechanism of quartz transitions from being grain boundary migration dominated to subgrain rotation dominated with increasing structural level. Now, within the choking arm, this is just quickly to show that we do see evidence for ductile deformation in the choking arm leucogranite. So that means at some point following its crystallization, it underwent ductile deformation. We will be able to confirm this with the rubidium strontium data later. And then finally, moving into the Tethyan sedimentary sequence, we cross a major lithological boundary into marbles, and the primary deforming mineral becomes calcite. So the calcite here forms an interconnected matrix, and we see that it deforms by dynamic recrystallization, by grain boundary migration, and some part of subgrain rotation as well. So this dynamically recrystallization would have controlled the size and distribution of the grains. All of these recrystallized grains are then overprinted by these twins, these tabular twins, and because they are overprinting these dynamically recrystallized grains, we interpret them to have occurred after the dynamic recrystallization. Specifically, the type of twins that we see are these type 1 and 2 twins, and they have not been affected by the dynamic recrystallization. So to summarize, in the Tethyan sedimentary sequence, we see two different phases of deformation, an early dynamic recrystallization phase and a later phase with mechanical twinning that overprints the dynamically recrystallized grains. Okay, so now we can try to get temperature estimates for these different deformation and kinematic processes. In the greater Himalayan sequence, I got temperature estimates from the titanium and biotite method, as well as from quartz microstructures. So these quartz microstructures include deformation mechanisms in pink here on the diagram, as well as slip systems that I inferred from quartz C-axis distributions. I also used the quartz C-axis opening angle thermometer. So together, all of these methods provide broad deformation temperature ranges, but they overlap within the 5 to 600 degree temperature range. And we see this transition from grain boundary migration to subgrain rotation dominated dynamic recrystallization towards higher structural levels. And this might indicate a slight decrease in deformation temperature upsection throughout the greater Himalayan sequence. So now moving into the Tethyan sedimentary sequence, I estimated deformation temperatures from the active deformation mechanisms that we identified. And because we identified two of them, we get two calcite deformation temperature estimates. So the first is for the dynamic recrystallization, that early phase of ductile deformation. And dynamic recrystallization in calcite is typically associated with temperatures above 400 degrees. On the other hand, mechanical twinning is typically associated with temperatures below 400 degrees. And the specific type of twins that we see, type 1 and 2 twins, are associated with the lower temperature range that mechanical twinning is active, so potentially below 200 degrees Celsius. And because the twins overprint the dynamically recrystallized grains, we know that they occurred later. So the temperature estimates that we have in the Tethyan sedimentary sequence seem to indicate that deformation occurred under cooling conditions and also to relatively low temperatures. So overall, these temperature estimates highlight two stages of ductile deformation throughout the shear zone. A higher temperature stage, which affects both Greater Himalayan sequence and Tethyan sedimentary sequence, which would be followed in time by a lower temperature stage, which only affects the Tethyan sedimentary sequence. Okay, and finally, I looked at deformation stresses, so differential stresses during the deformation. And to do this, I used the quartz subgrain size piezometer in the Greater Himalayan sequence and the calcite grain size piezometer in the Tethyan sedimentary sequence. And so the stresses obtained from this are the differential stresses that were active during the deformation that led to the development of either the subgrains or the grain sizes. And in both of these cases, the process that led to this is dynamic recrystallization, and it's linked to the higher temperature portion of the deformation phase. So the results from this show similar orders of magnitude of stress in both the Greater Himalayan sequence and the Tethyan sedimentary sequence for this high temperature phase, and show that the stresses are generally pretty low, so below 22 megapascals. Okay, and the last portion of the results that I want to present are the in situ rubidium strontium geochronology results. So the goal here is to take the kinematic and deformation process information that I just presented and to try to establish a chronological link to it. And what's fun about rubidium strontium geochronology is that we can directly date micas directly within their microstructural context. So we're able to directly date micas that are associated with the deformation fabrics that we have already studied. And what's also fun with it is the ability of the rubidium strontium system to reset during deformation and our capacity to therefore try to get deformation ages from it. So here on the slide, we have some examples of ablation slots in the Tethyan sedimentary sequence and the Greater Himalayan sequence. So data from different microstructures are compiled into isochrons in order to obtain dates and are then interpreted. So these are the rubidium strontium results, and we see different results for different microstructures analyzed. Starting within the Choking arm, leucogranites, we have these undeformed inclusions of white mica in large plagioclase macrocrysts, and these give a date of 22 MA. This is the oldest date that we obtain. Now, because these inclusions are spared of any deformation, this 22 MA date is interpreted as a cooling age related to the initial crystallization of the choking arm leucogranite. And the reason that I can link the cooling to the crystallization is because it corresponds to the known ages of emplacement of the Manaslu Pluton. So this occurred in two pulses, one at 22 MA and one at 19 MA. So the 22 MA leucogranite age in my field area corresponds to this first pulse of Manaslu Plutonism, and it confirms also a long inferred association between the Chokangarm leucogranite and the Manaslu main body. So the dates in this box, these are interpreted as representing the time of ongoing South Tibetan Detachment System activity along the transect. They range from 17 to 13 MA. And because the South Tibetan Detachment System facilitated normal sense deformation within the shear zone, the deformation is intimately linked to cooling of lithologies both within the shear zone and beneath it. So these dates are interpreted as deformation and cooling dates related to activity on the South Tibetan Detachment System zone. So now if we look inside the box, we can see that the timing of deformation and cooling varies slightly along the transect, and this can either indicate that actually at different structural levels, the deformation occurred at slightly different times, but it's much more likely just the result of applying the rubidium strontium method to different types of micas with different effective closure temperatures and different sizes. So what this means is that unfortunately the resolution that we obtain from rubidium strontium geochronology here doesn't give us the capacity to resolve the timing, relative timing of the different deformation processes within the shear zone. But it's still interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, historically, the South Tibetan detachment system has just been dated indirectly. So here now we have direct ages for South Tibetan detachment system activity, and they actually align very well with the previous constraints in the Manaslu region for the timing of the South Tibetan detachment system. So those are my results. Now it's time to pull them all together and present the structural evolution of the detachment system. So to do this, we need to use the concept of self-similarity. And this is the process or the property where geological materials or structures exhibit very similar patterns across geometry and across different scales, from the microscale all the way to the macro scale. And using this concept, we can use information from the kinematic and deformation analyses that we just did, or that I just presented, to make inferences about macroscopic tectonic regime and to try to decipher the relative importance of different potential controlling factors of the South Tibetan detachment system evolution. So this diagram is going to depict the structural evolution of the detachment system. We're going to fill it in slowly. Here on the y-axis is temperature, which generally increases with depth in the crust, but not necessarily in a linear relationship, especially here as we're at a tectonic boundary with complex processes of heat redistribution. The colored zone here in the center of the diagram, well, this is extended out from the cross section, and this represents the high strain zone of the cross section, down into higher temperatures. These dark shaded regions here, these represent the temperatures for which we have evidence for active ductile deformation at each structural level. So from the kinematic analyses, we confirmed that the South Tibetan Detachment System is a single high strain zone operating under general shear. This means that there's both important components of pure and simple shear. And a significant pure shear component across the shear zone is aligning with tectonic thinning. And this is also consistent, this is consistent with the extensional nature of the shear zone. We also, tectonic thinning is also consistent with the steep temperature gradient that we see in the South Tibetan Detachment System. So from 5 to 600 degrees in the Greater Himalayan sequence, all the way down to below 170 degrees in the Tethyan sedimentary sequence. So the pure shear would have stretched and thinned the crust and brought these deeper, hotter rocks into close proximity with cooler and shallower ones. So while the high strain zone are within the high strain zone, we see top to the north shearing, but at its boundaries, we saw that we had an over, or we saw that we had top east shearing, so east directed flow, and these boundary rocks also show high strain and somewhat different strain geometry. So because there's no major differences with the rocks directly at the boundaries and within the zone, in terms of the lithology, it's not very likely that lithology is what controlled this transition to top east flow at the boundaries. So this leaves two possible interpretations for the boundaries. First is that the top east flow represents strain partitioning during a single South Tibetan Detachment System shearing event. And while some variations in simple shear component indicate that some strain partitioning was occurring, um, we don't see we see that just generally throughout the shear zone we have both important components of pure and simple shear. So this is maybe not a very important process in the shear zone. Alternatively, another option is that the top east shear represents overprinting from a later deformation event with different kinematics. And unfortunately, the resolution of the rubidium strontium geochronology doesn't allow us to determine that the rocks at the boundary of the shear zone actually deformed later than the rocks directly within it. But what we do know is that the cessation of the South Tibetan Detachment System zone is typically linked with a transition in orogenic kinematics to this east-west extensional regime, so origin parallel extension that occurs along north-south striking structures in the upper crust. And in the region just adjacent to my field area, so the Annapurna region, this transition in kinematics is documented at 17 to 14 million years, which overlaps with our 17 to 13 million year South Tibetan Detachment System timing for the Tsum Valley. So this is actually a possible explanation for the top east flow at the top of the shear zone, where where we know that the deformation occurred, especially at the top towards lower temperatures. So it could represent this transition to a new kinematic regime of east-west extension. So now we're going to focus away from the boundaries and look within the top north zone to see if we can decipher what controlled its internal evolution. At high temperatures and deeper in the crust, we see that the active deformation is distributed across a wide zone that includes both Greater Himalayan sequence and Tethyan sedimentary sequence rocks. So during this stage, we found similar differential stresses in both of these units. And these differential stresses actually match differential stresses from elsewhere in the Himalaya that's related to this early shear zone portion of the South Tibetan Detachment System. As we move towards higher structural levels still within the Greater Himalayan sequence, we see an increasingly localized deformation style at the microscale. And we can interpret this microscale localization to reflect macroscale localization and an upsection migration of the deformation, even just within the greater Himalayan sequence. And because the lithologies of the greater Himalayan sequence are very similar in terms of mineral composition, this was likely controlled not by lithology, but by decreasing temperatures, either through isotherms with increasing structural level, or just through time as normal activity on the South Tibetan attachment system occurred. And then finally, at lower temperatures, we only see evidence for ductile deformation within the Tethyan sedimentary sequence marbles. So this tells us that as normal sense motion progressed and the rocks cooled and were exhumed, deformation localized from this distributed ductile shear zone at depth into the carbonate-rich rocks of the Tethyan sedimentary sequence at higher structural levels. So what this implies is that here in the Tsum Valley, the presence of marbles at high structural level was really important part of the story. And that these marbles, because these marbles have the capacity to remain weak at relatively low temperatures, this is what would have allowed the ductile deformation to persist, or for deformation to persist in a ductile manner, in within relatively cold and shallow crustal levels, and this without the formation of a discrete brittle structure. So as I mentioned already, this means that in the Tsum Valley, lithology was an important control in controlling the way that strain localized with decreasing temperatures and over time. So that's the evolution of the Tsum Valley, and I'd just like to finish off very quickly by comparing my findings to studies elsewhere in the Himalaya that have been identifying similar patterns. So an upsection migration of localization and strain in the South Tibetan attachment system has been noted in multiple sections of the Himalaya, even just within the ductile shear component, such as this example here from Zurgala by Zhang and colleagues. So here the lithologies of the ductile shear zone are very similar to the greater Himalayan sequence of the Tsum Valley. And like in the Tsum Valley, deformation progressed and localized towards higher structural levels and with decreasing temperatures into quartz and micas. So here, the upsection migration of deformation does result in the formation of a discrete brittle fault at higher structural level. This is consistent with the expected behavior of a deformation zone. So as the ductile and brittle transitions of the constituent deforming minerals are reached with decreasing temperatures. So the controls of this upsection migration here are the structural level and cooling related to progressive normal sense shearing on the South Tibetan detachment system with time. Now, some other studies have also been showing that lithology may play a really important role in the way that the deformation migrates upwards with time. So some studies by Nanya and colleagues in two areas, the Lower Dopal and Kaligandaki regions. These regions are similar to the Tsum Valley in that they contain calcite-rich rocks at higher structural levels. And in these studies, they interpret that the presence of weak calcite-bearing lithologies allowed for ductile shearing to continue into low temperatures and shallow levels of the crust without reaching the brittle ductile transition, and therefore for the upsection migration to occur without the development of a discrete brittle fault. So to conclude, what controlled the structural evolution of the South Tibetan detachment system? We saw that structural level and cooling with progressive South Tibetan detachment system activity led to strain localization towards shallower structural levels. We saw that lithology was very important in determining the deformation regime, so whether that upsection migration occurred in a ductile or brittle manner. And finally, potentially, that the cessation of the South Tibetan detachment system led to a transition of east-directed to east-directed flow at the boundaries of the high strain zone. So thanks a lot for listening. Thanks again to all the folks at the UBC Tectonics and Geochronology group, and thanks for the Canadian Tectonics group for giving me this opportunity to share these findings. Looking forward to discussing with you all.